What's up, guys? It's Erratic here, and today I'm going to go over a Preservation Evoker healing guide for the War Within Season 2. We're currently in patch 11.07. 11.1 is on the horizon, but it doesn't look like there's going to be that much of a change for Evoker's healing, other than the tier set changes. So this guide should stay pretty current, but I am planning on updating it pretty soon after the patch drops. Preservation is one of the most fun healers, in my opinion. I've played every healer up to a certain level. I think it's a very high action, very high APM healer. You get to be very active with doing damage, and the healing throughput is pretty fun as well. It keeps me very engaged when I'm playing. I would definitely suggest it if you are looking for a little bit more active healing. Some of the healers are a little bit more passive, still super powerful, but I really enjoy the Evoker playstyle, so I can't suggest it enough. If you don't know me, I am Erratic Gaming. I've been working on this spec for about a season and a half now, and I'm feeling pretty confident with where I am with the spec. I'm currently number 39 in solo shuffle, and we've gotten as high as 2388 in threes. I'm hoping to reach my first Gladiator this season. So if you'd like to follow that journey along, come follow me over on Twitch, and make sure you're subscribed to the channel, because I'm also going to be posting videos over here. That being said, we're going to get right into it. I just want to kind of let you know what we're getting into for this video. There's going to be timestamps down in the description if you'd like to skip around. We're going to start off talking about our specialization briefly. We're going to talk about our hero talents, our stat priority and gearing. We're going to talk about how to heal as a Preservation Evoker, how to do damage as a Preservation Evoker. We're going to talk about our utility, and then we're going to talk about our PvP talents, and then the floating talents that you can kind of switch between based on the enemy composition. And then we're going to talk about our best and worst comps, macros, and then at the end of the video there's going to be a TLDR where I'm going to try to very briefly explain how the class works if you want to go ahead and skip to that. So let's get started. For our spec, I'm going to show you the very basic spec that I would suggest. If you're first getting into Preservation Evoker, I would say just use this for a while until you're feeling a little bit more comfortable with the class. I think this is going to be the most beginner friendly version of the spec. Or there's going to be the import code in the description. You can click it there. Chrono Warden is really the only hero talent tree to play. There might be some specific scenarios where Flame Shaper beats it, but I mean Chrono Warden is just insane. I'm going to quickly go through the Chrono Warden tree. It turns your living plane into Chrono Flame, which is just gonna make it more powerful. It's going to make your hover a blink and also give it a defensive aspect to it. It's going to cause your tip the scales to give you a haste, movement speed, and CDR, that's cooldown recovery rate increase of 30% that decays over time. This is the most insane part of Chrono Warden. It's going to buff your Spirit Bloom to give you haste and apply a hot. It's going to give your allies a little bit of a buff to their damage, and then it's also going to make your Echo more powerful, and it's also going to cause your empowered spells to shoot out Chrono Flames, which are going to do extra healing or damage. So it's just a huge boost to healing for Preservation Evokers. Next up, we're going to talk about gearing. Really, you're just looking to have versatility and haste on every piece of gear. You want your tier pieces in the head, shoulders, gloves, and leg slots. For your embellishments, I would suggest getting the two energy redistribution beacons on either your rings or your neck. I would highly suggest crafting these three pieces specifically, just because the secondary stats on these are so high and you really are looking for that haste. I think Mastery was favored a little bit early in the season just because the damage looked a little different, but right now you just want to be able to cast as many abilities as you can. The throughput's there. You just have to use your abilities correctly to keep people up. Mastery is going to increase your healing done to allies whenever your health is higher than theirs. It is a good mastery, but haste just way outperforms it. I was favoring this for a while and I switched to haste, and it's like night and day how much easier the game feels. Mastery always works on yourself, so when you're healing yourself, it's always going to be applied. So I'm always doing 27% more healing to myself. But when you're in threes or shuffles and stuff like that, if you're stacking mastery and your health falls below your allies and you're trying to heal them, that's going to feel pretty bad. So I would just say that the haste is better in general, and I think pretty much everyone agrees. For The rest of your gear, you can craft every piece of gear to be haste mastery if you want to like really min max, but I would say it's probably not required other than the rings and the neck. For gems, we want the precog gem, which I believe it's called Cognitive Bloodstone. So you have to craft this through crafting orders unless you're a jewel crafter, and then the rest of your gems are just going to be Masterful Emerald. Obviously, if you feel like you're getting targeted or something like that, you could put in some versatility. It's fine to do more mastery if you want more mastery, but like I said, I think haste is the most important. For enchants, we're going to put Chant of Burrowing Rapidity on your back, which gives you movement speed, counts as intellect on your chest, which increases your intellect, maybe your mana pool. I can't remember the exact effect of it. On your wrists, you want 1,000 speed. On the legs, you want the Daybreak Spell Thread, which is 747 intellect and 5% mana. For your feet, you want Scout's March, which is going to increase your movement speed. And then on your rings, you want Cursed Mastery. I did say haste is the better stat, but in this case, crit is so bad for Preservation Evokers that getting rid of some of your crit to give you mastery is actually pretty good. You could put on the 315, haste or versatility enchants or even mastery if you prefer, if they're cheaper, but I think Cursed Mastery comes out to be the best. And then on your weapon, you do have the choice of the different enchants. There's different evokers who use different ones. I think Authority of Fiery Resolve is going to be the best bet and the most beginner friendly. It's just going to cause your healing spells to do additional healing to allies. Sometimes the other ones I think increase your mastery and haste occasionally. So yeah, Fiery Resolve is going to be the one I suggest. For evokers, our unique power resource is going to be Essence. We have 2 abilities that use Essence. That's going to be Echo and Disintegrate. Echo costs 2 Essence and 33,000 mana. And then Disintegrate just costs 3 Essence. Essence will recharge automatically over time. And we're going to talk about Essence Burst here in a little bit, where Living Flame and Reversion have a chance to cause your next Essence ability to be free. So this is a big part of the Preservation Evoker class, but we'll get into that a little bit more later. So to get started, instead of going through the talent trees and just going over every single talent, I'm going to go over our abilities and kind of go over the modifiers that affect them. To start off with healing, we've got Reversion. This is probably going to be our most used ability. It is on a 7.5 second recharge, and it has 2 charges thanks to the talents. I'm just going to pull up everything that affects it. So again, casting Reversion has a chance to cause an Essence Burst, which will make your next Essence ability free. It's going to instantly heal the target for 15% of the damage taken in the last 5 seconds. And it also has a chance to cause your next Living Flame cast to be instant and deal 50% increased healing and damage. This is not just the initial cast of Reversion, but also the hot that gets applied from Reversion has a chance to proc Life Spark, and we're going to be talking about this a lot. Also, the Reversion buff is going to cause your target to take 10% more healing. So the Reversion hot is like one of the most important things to keep up while you're healing. I don't know if we talked about this with Echo, but basically we're going to be trying to echo every healing ability that we can. And Reversion's no different. So I'm going to target myself. Let me actually hop into a follower dungeon here really quick, because I think that's probably the best way to show this. All right. So we're in the follower dungeon. This is just going to be the best way for me to show the buffs and debuffs and stuff like that and how they work together. So for Reversion, we want to echo and then Reversion someone. You're going to see that they get 2 hots. This is going to equal out to 10% more healing per dot. And then both of these ticking heals are also going to have a chance to proc Life Spark, which is going to give you an instant cast Chrono Flame. So keeping these up on your target are going to be super important. The other thing is Reversion is healing your target. If you echo it, it's healing your target for 30% of the damage that they've taken in the last 5 seconds. So it can be very, very good at burst healing. Like imagine your partner takes 80% of their damage in the last, 2 globals. You're going to be healing them for half their HP. This is going to be doing huge amounts of healing. The only other thing I would like to mention about reversion is it doesn't calculate the damage correctly when you're in a cyclone. So if you come out, I need to turn off these guys talking here really quick. So reversion does not calculate correctly when you're in a cyclone. So if you come out of like a 6-second cyclone and you have a teammate that's taking a bunch of damage, you echo reversion, it's not going to heal like it should. I think this is a bug, but it's been in the game since Evokers were released and hasn't been fixed yet. So you're just going to want to keep that kind of in the back of your mind and come up with a better plan for healing out of a cyclone. Verdant Embrace is going to be our next kind of most used ability. When you Verdant Embrace a target, it is going to apply the life bind effect, which is going to cause, well, it links both you and your partner. And if I echo one target and then I Verdant Embrace another, it's going to give all three of us life bind, which, like I said, it's going to link all three of you, and every direct healing that the target receives is going to be copied onto anybody else with life bind at 40%. This is going to be very important for doing massive amounts of AoE healing. So I'm going to like target the mage, echo, Verdant Embrace the hunter. We all four have life bind. That means for the next 5 seconds, we're all receiving additional healing. You also need to keep in mind that Verdant Embrace is going to take you to your target. So it can put you kind of in a bad position or a good position. You know, you could use it to get in a good position, but you need to keep that kind of in the back of your mind. It can also be good for getting out of like Z-axis, like Mugambala or Robodrome. You know, sometimes you end up just using it because you want to be able to get away from enemies. So it can be used in all those different ways. The last thing I want to mention about Verdant Embrace is that it also increases the healing of your next Dream Breath or Living Flame by 100%. So we'll talk about these more when we get to those healing abilities. Spirit Bloom is going to be the biggest healing ability for the spec at this moment due to our hero talents and just spec tree in general. So in our Chrono Warden hero talent tree, where Spirit Bloom is going to give, or it's going to put a 8-second hot on the target after you cast it. If you charge it up to 3, which you should always aim to do, it's going to give you 9% haste. It's going to give you 3% haste per charge. And then our after image down here at the bottom, every empower spell you cast is going to send up to 3 additional chrono flames to your targets. So just massive AoE healing. It's on a 14-second cooldown. It doesn't show it in the tooltip, but we've got a talent here that reduces it by 10 seconds. And then this ability, Instability Matrix, reduces its cooldown by 6 seconds after you cast it. So it's a 14-second cooldown, and it's massive. Again, you're going to want to echo before you use it on your main target pretty much every time, because it's going to be our biggest heal. If you are playing the Font of Magic talent, your maximum empower level is going to go up by 1. You don't ever really need to charge Spirit Bloom up to 4. You don't really receive the effect from it. The only case where you might want to do this is if there's like a pet on your team and you're wanting to get that extra healing, but that's so niche that I would say don't ever worry about doing that. The other thing I'd like to say is like it's really good to get like life bind up on all your targets before you echo Spirit Bloom, because it's just going to be massive healing to the whole team, right? Like everyone that gets hit by Spirit Bloom is also copying that to everyone else with life bind. So that's a great combo to get massive AoE healing. Dream Breath is going to be our big hot, and as much as possible, you want to kind of just use this to maintain, you know, passive healing. Dream Breath is going to heal a cone in front of you. You can see it when you're charging it up. Anyone that you echo before you Dream Breath is going to receive double the hot. I didn't mention this with reversion, but you don't ever want to split your reversion. You don't want to echo one target and put your reversion on another target like you kind of do with Verdant Embrace, because really what you want is the double reversion on a single target. And you can't like use 2 reversions in a row to get double reversion. The only way to get double reversion buffs on your target is to echo then reversion. That is not the case with Dream Breath. You do want to echo, you know, 1, 2 targets. Even you could do 3. It's hard to get 3 echoes off before you cast a spell, because you basically want to use it for every healing spell. But now, because I've echoed 2 targets and I use Dream Breath, we're going to have 2 targets that are getting, you know, massive heals. Again, you want to use echo and then Verdant Embrace on 2 targets that you're healing, because it's going to increase the Dream Breath healing by 40%. So you don't have to necessarily use Verdant Embrace right before you cast Dream Breath, but you know, within 10 seconds, maybe when you're planning on using Dream Breath, you want to cast it, and avoid using Chrono Flames if you're wanting the buff to go on the Dream Breath hot. You can charge this up for more healing at the front end of Dream Breath and a smaller hot, but typically you're just going to one charge this because it's better kind of as a maintenance heal than as a burst heal. Next up, we've got Chrono Flames, which is just our single target, you know, casted heal, but you're almost never going to be casting it this way. The only time you're going to be casting Chrono Flames for healing is generally from the Life Spark talent, which is where your reversion has a chance to cause your Chrono Flames to be instant cast. So if I put 2 stacks of reversion up on 2 targets, I should get a proc here in a second. That's going to allow me to cast Chrono Flames instantly. That's how you're going to be using it. You're going to get this proc. It's going to be the red icon up here, and you'll see the icon up here. I'll show it to you once it comes up. You're going to be using Chrono Flame for both. So here's the buff. You're going to get this little icon on your character. That's when you have instant cast Chrono Flames. When you can, you still want to echo it because it's like super massive healing. Instant cast, which is nice. It's just a nice little flavor that the Preservation Evoker has. It was a previous tier set that kind of almost felt necessary to the class. Like I said, you're not really ever going to be hard casting it if you get locked on Chrono Flames. Because of the hero talent tree, it is considered both fire and bronze magic, so you're going to be locked out of all your bronze spells and your fire magic if you get locked on it. Now you still have green spells, you know, and blue spells. Blue spells don't heal at all, but you still have green spells to heal. So, you know, if you're not worried about it because you have those other spells, it's fine to maybe hard cast. But like, I would say in 90% of games, I'm never casting a healing Chrono Flame hard cast. It is only instant cast that I'm using. And the last thing I want to mention as far as healing is just the Essence Burst again. Living Flame and Reversions both have a chance to cause an Essence Burst, which makes your next echo free if we're using it for healing. Also with the Spark of Insight talent, which you're going to be running probably as a beginner Preservation Evoker, when you consume a full Temporal Compression, it's going to give you an Essence Burst, so that's good to keep in mind. Temporal Compression is going to basically make it to where every time you cast a bronze spell, it's going to give you a stack of Temporal Compression. Once you get to 4 stacks, it's going to make your next Empower spell cast 40% faster. The Spark of Insight talent is going to make it to where once you cast that empowered spell, you get an instant Essence Burst. So when you're feeling Essence starved, most likely you're going to have a Temporal Compression up. You should probably track it, but like here, I'm going to cast Echo and Reversion, and that's 3 stacks because I casted 1 bronze spell and this counted as 2 bronze spells. And then maybe I'm casting Echo on another target. That's 4 stacks of Temporal Compression. So maybe I'm Essence starved. I need to Echo, but I can't. I can just cast a quick Fire Breath, you know, or Dream Breath, and I'm going to have a free Essence there. That's just a good thing to keep in the back of your mind. I'm going to go over the rotation here in a little bit, but I'm going to talk about our cooldowns really quick first. Stasis is going to be our big healing cooldown that is on a relatively short cooldown. What Stasis does is you use Stasis and it stores your next 3 healing abilities. And then when you release Stasis, it's going to cast those 3 healing abilities in quick succession. So there's going to be 2 combos that I would suggest. The first one is going to be to use Stasis, cast Verdant Embrace, Echo, and then Spirit Bloom. And the reason for that is, like, let's say I Echo someone here. This is before the Stasis. Then I'm going to Stasis, and I'm going to Verdant Embrace next target. I'm going to Echo that target, and then I'm going to cast a 3-charge Spirit Bloom. That's going to make it to where when you release a Stasis, it's going to Verdant Embrace this character, Echo this character, and then do a 3-charge Spirit Bloom, and it's going to all be within the span of like a second. It's going to be a massive AoE heal, and it doesn't matter how far away your targets are when you're casting it from Echo. So it's a very, I say it doesn't matter. I haven't seen it to where it doesn't actually go and heal the people they were, even if I'm like across the map. That is going to be the best combo for Stasis. Here, I'm going to release it and you can kind of see what happens. So you see, it just does massive healing. It's hard to tell because these guys aren't damaged, but yeah, you can release Stasis while you're in CC with the use of a macro, which we'll go over later. So you can use it while you're in Cyclone and Polys, whatever. So you want to get this up and running at the start of a match as soon as possible, and then you basically want to keep it on cooldown, just because it's a great way to keep your team alive when you are CC'd, which Preservation Evokers are kind of susceptible to. I did mention that there would be 2 combos. The next combo is going to be to Verdant Embrace a character. Again, that's just to get the life bind up, and then you're going to do a 3 charge Spirit Bloom and a Dream Breath. I don't like this combo as much because the Dream Breath does require line of sight and for them to be in range. And like, say you're in a polymorph or you're Cyclone and your team's not away from you, you're not going to be able to use Dream Breath. Ideally for me, I'm pretty much always saving Stasis to be used when I am in a CC. It does automatically release after 30 seconds. So if you don't use it by then, I mean, it's going to release and you're going to get the effects from it. But often, sometimes you want to like release it instead of using maybe some other heals just to make sure you're getting value out of it. Because if you just let it expire on 30 seconds, maybe your team's completely full health and then it doesn't feel as good. Our next cooldown is going to be Emerald Communion. This is the 3-minute cooldown. It does 20% of your health and 2% of your mana every 8 seconds for 4.2 seconds. I don't know if these values are adjusted for my haste, but basically this is going to be a big heal on yourself, and then as soon as you reach full health, it's going to transfer all that healing to teammates that are within 40 yards and line of sight. It does require line of sight to be used. That being said, if you have life bind up, then it is going to immediately be doing AoE healing to the whole team, and that is how this cooldown is best used. You really, 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 really want to try to have the whole team with the life bind buff before you use Communion, so that you can get the full effect of it. You can see it's doing massive healing to the whole team. Sometimes it's just not going to be possible, and when you use it, it feels bad, but sometimes it still keeps people alive. And again, just remember, if you're at half health, it's going to have to heal you to full health before it starts healing anyone else. This Emerald Communion can be shut down by specific CCs completely. Those CCs are going to be Cyclone. Priest can mind control you to where it starts healing their team instead. Diamond Ice is going to stop it, and then DH Banish is going to stop it. So a lot of times I will try to use it when I am either DR'd on those CCs, or I know they're not going to be able to cast it, or I know it's on cooldown for the enemy team. Emerald Communion is kind of like your I don't have a trinket spell. That's kind of how I think about it. So in most games, my first, oh shit, is going to be a trinket. And then my second one, when I don't have a trinket, is going to be Communion. The only time that changes is when you're going to go into a dampening game because of the mana regen. You might want to use Emerald Communion as your first, team save. Your next healing cooldown is going to be Rewind. It's going to rewind 33% of the damage taken in the last 5 seconds by all allies within 40 yards. This one does not require line of sight. So you can be, behind a pillar. You can be walled off from a mage. You can have a teammate in a shadowy duel or a blanking on the name of it, but the shadow cloud, and it will hit them. And this is, especially for that rogue situation I'm talking about, this is often how I save people who get shadowy dueled or smoke bombed. This is only good when your team has taken high burst damage in the last 5 seconds. If you're just struggling to keep your team up against rot damage and your team has just slowly lost damage over time, and you use Rewind, you're going to be very upset by how much healing it does, because it's going to do basically nothing. So really, you're looking to use this right after burst damage, like maybe it just something like TSG or like Draco Cleave or something like that, where your whole team is just taking massive amounts of damage very quickly. Rewind along with Reversion does not calculate damage correctly when you're in a Cyclone, Banish, or Diamond Ice. No, sorry, that's not correct. Rewind just doesn't calculate damage correctly when you're in a Cyclone. So if you come out of a 6-second Cyclone and your team's taking a lot of damage and you go to hit Rewind, it is not going to work how you want to. So make sure you have a different game plan for recovering your team if you're sitting a full cyclone. That being said, we're going to talk about trinket usage a little bit later, but trinketing a cyclone at the start of the cyclone as opposed to the end to use rewind is going to be a lot better. Rescue is going to be our final healing cooldown, and I honestly probably should have mentioned this first. This is going to be probably our best healing cooldown, and I'm going to show you why here in just a second. I'm going to see if I can move this tank over here. So we got this tank here, right? And it's on this side of the pillar. Let's say they're taking a lot of damage from casters, whatever. It's kind of hard. I wish I could get the tank to stay right here. But I want to show you kind of how it works. When you hit rescue, you're going to get a reticle to click where you want to rescue the target to. You're going to fly to your target, and then you're going to take them to where you have the reticle at. Even if they're at, you know, on one side of the pillar and you want to bring them to the other side of the pillar, that's possible as long as the location you want to take them to is within your line of sight. So this is one of our biggest saves. It's also going to give them a 30% shield because of the talent Twin Guardian. It's going to give them a 30% damage shield. So like I said, this person's out here taking tons of damage from casters. You need a few seconds to recover. My rescue is on an at cursor macro, so you're not going to see the reticle, but I can pull them from over here to over here. You see, did like a little. So now they're LOS. Even if it's melee chasing them, I'm going to have a few seconds to restore their health and get them up. This is going to be like kind of our biggest save, and it should be used before rewind or communion in most situations unless it's, you know, AoE damage. You can also use rescue to get up on Z-axis, so on maps like Mugumbala or Robodrome, stuff like that. If there's like a platform up here and, you know, maybe you want to rescue your teammate up there to LOS, you know, and get to safety, you can do that. You can also use it offensively. So like say you have melee on your team and you've got a lock that's supporting up there, you can bring your melee up to the platform with rescue offensively, and that is like one of the coolest feelings on Preservation Evoker. That's one of the reasons I love Evokers so much. So that kind of covers all of our healing spells. For our general healing rotation, the goal is going to be to keep Echo Reversion up on your main target. You kind of want to keep Echo Reversion up on 2 targets if possible, just due to the Life Spark talent where you'll be getting instant cast Chrono Flames off of the, you know, ticking hots. You want to be Verdant Embracing on cooldown. You want to echo one target and Verdant Embrace the other target so that you can get a whole team massive AoE heals off. You don't have to use Verdant Embrace that way. Honestly, I would say Verdant Embrace is probably your least important spell to echo, but it is still super, super strong if you echo it. So you should do it as often as possible. I'm just saying that it's maybe the least important to echo. It does a good amount of healing and applies the Life Bind buff. We want to be casting Spirit Bloom on cooldown, and we want to be charging it to 3 every time. You want to echo your main target as often as possible before Spirit Bloom. Again, when you use Spirit Bloom, you're going to be getting a hot on the target, 9% haste if you charge it to 3, and it's just going to be one of your biggest heals because it's also going to be releasing those Chrono Flames that do additional healing. When you look at your healing breakdown in arenas, like Living Flame is often going to be one of your top heals, and it's because of the after image talent. And then for just constant hots in the background, you're going to want to echo 2 targets and then Dream Breath them. Again, you don't have to echo 2 targets if you maybe don't have the essence to do it, but echoing 2 is going to be the most efficient way to use this, and it's going to relieve a lot of pressure from your healing. You're going to be using the instant cast Life Spark Chrono Flames for healing as needed, and you will also want to echo these as possible. So whenever you have the reversion ticks, you're going to get the Life Spark procs, and you can echo and send those for instant healing as you're moving, whatnot. And then the last thing I would mention is that Echo Reversion is a good burst healing single target option as well. Chrono Flame is going to beat that out probably as long as they have the reversion buffs up, but if they're taking massive amounts of damage, you can Echo Reversion one target and then Echo Reversion them again if they're still just taking massive burst damage, and then you could even do it like a 3rd time if it's come off cooldown. You don't want to use it this way as like a normal thing, but it is a way to get through those moments of high burst damage. So that kind of brings us to the end of our general healing. So we need to kind of move on to our damage. Preservation Evokers are really good because of how offensive they are, and their offensive utility is if you're not using it, you're not playing Preservation Evoker right. You can't just stand back and heal like some other healers. Our damaging abilities are going to be Chrono Flames. We were using it for healing, but you can also use it for damage. It's buffed by your hero talents, and it's also important to note that the Scarlet Adaptation buff stores your effective healing, 20% of your effective healing up to 134,000. And it's going to add that to your next living flame. So as often as possible, you want to be weaving Chrono Flames in throughout your healing rotation offensively to maximize that talent. And then another thing I want to mention is the Leaping Flames talent. This is going to cause your Fire Breath to make your next living flame strike additional targets. We're going to talk about Fire Breath here in just a second, but you do want to be careful with that because it can break CC. Let's talk about Living Flame first. Let's talk about Fire Breath first, and then I'll come back to that. Fire Breath you kind of want to be using on cooldown. It is going to do a good amount of fire damage in front of you. This is another one we want to fully charge to 3 as often as possible, and there's multiple reasons why. So number one, it goes back to the after image ability, where your empower spells send Chrono Flames to your targets. So you fully charge this, you're going to be sending 3 additional Chrono Flames to attack your targets. Let me get out of this instance here so we can see this. Let's see here. Okay, yeah, so if we fully charge a Fire Breath and then we cast a Chrono Flame, you're going to see that it's going to send Chrono Flames to a bunch of different targets. You can see that it hits some behind me. These are not smart Chrono Flames. They're not going to hit your target that you're targeting. They're going to hit any enemy, and it's going to send them to additional enemies. It's not going to send like 4 Chrono Flames to one target. So it's important to keep that in mind when using it, because you can, like I said, you can break CCs like polymorphs or fears or whatnot that just break on damage. So just be careful when you're using it that way, but you do want to fully charge Fire Breath as often as possible because you're going to get more upfront damage, and then you're going to get those additional Chrono Flames. When you pair it with the Life Giver's Flame talent, it's also going to heal allies for 80% of the damage done. That is the upfront damage and the dot that it applies to the target. So you can see it applies like a dot if you just one charge it. It's going to heal your allies for that amount. And then probably the biggest part of the Preservation Evoker toolkit is a Scouring Flame PvP talent. You won't use it in every scenario, and we're going to go over it in more detail, but it's going to dispel beneficial magic effects from enemies. The longer you empower it, the more it's going to dispel, and that is one of the reasons Preservation Evoker is so powerful. But as much as possible, you want to use Fire Breath on cooldown. Deep Breath is an ability that does a lot of damage. I wouldn't really consider it to be just a damage ability, but I'm going to include it in this section because yeah, it does do damage. Deep Breath, it's going to allow you to travel 50 yards, but you never want to use it that far, virtually ever. There might be certain situations, but the thing is it's kind of a slow travel ability, and you are not going to be able to cast any abilities while you're in the middle of the flight. So rather than go 50 yards, it's kind of better to hover, and then when you're next to the target, then you're going to Deep Breath the short distance. With Deep Breath, when you're playing the Terror of the Skies talent, it's going to stun all of the enemies that are hit for 3 seconds. This is really the utility of Deep Breath. So that's really more how it's used. The other thing about Deep Breath is you cannot be CC'd while you're in the Deep Breath. So as soon as you get the cast off, you do like a little inhale and then you fly. And even during the inhale, you're un-CCable. And so I would say that Deep Breath is way more often used to avoid CC and to stun targets rather than the pure damage. Disintegrate is our last major damaging spell. It costs 3 essence. I would only ever use Disintegrate when you have an essence burst. 3 essence is far too much for you to use on a damaging ability, but it does do a lot of damage and it slows your enemies. Disintegrate can also be used with Energy Loop to do 35% more damage, so you're being a lot more aggressive, and it restores mana, and we'll kind of talk about when we can take that talent a little bit later. But yeah, you only want to use it when you have an essence burst. I'm kind of trying to get an essence burst right now. It gets triggered off of reversion. It's only the initial reversion cast too, so like Reversion. There's an essence burst. So now I can cast, Disintegrate for free without losing any of my essence. Zero Strike is a damaging ability. It's low cost mana and it does very little damage and applies a 2-second slow. I guess it's 3 seconds. It says, oh, it doesn't even say the slow in the tooltip, but yeah, it applies like a 3-second slow to the enemy and does a little bit of damage. I will say I never hit this a button except for maybe trying to get in combat to avoid rogue saps or something like that. I would almost go as far as to say that you don't need this keybound, but that would be ludicrous because there's definitely weird situations where you could probably use it. So just to kind of go over our general damage rotation again, we're basically just going to be casting Fire Breath on cooldown, trying to get it to 3 charges as often as possible. We're going to instant cast Chrono Flames when we can as damage when they're not needed for healing. We're going to Disintegrate with Essence Burst, again, when we don't need to use the Essence for healing. And then you can hard cast Chrono Flames if your team is healthy or you're like really close to a kill. When you're able to cast Chrono Flames offensively for damage, usually it's a little bit more okay to get interrupted because you're not having to, like, just from the sheer fact that you're casting it as damage means you're not having to heal your team. So if you get interrupted on Fire and Bronze, it's probably okay. You still have Disintegrate for damage, and then you also have green spells for healing. Next up, I want to go over our utility. And we have to start off with Tips of Scales. This is the biggest part of the Chrono Warden talent tree. Chrono Warden is going to cause your next empowered spell to instantly cast and at the max level. Because of the talent Temporal Burst hero talent tree ability, you're going to get 30% haste, 30% movement speed, and 30% CD recovery rate. And it decreases by 1% every second for 30 seconds. So this is like an insane ability. Usually I will try to set up my stasis at the beginning of a match and then use a tip Fire Breath, tip, maybe Spirit Bloom. You can use it on Fire Breath, which is generally how you'll use it just because it's massive damage, especially if you have the Scouring Flame talent and instant cast, Fire Breath, it does a ton of damage and purges, 4 magic effects if you're running Font of Magic off of every thing you hit is insane. And then on top of that, you get the extra haste. It's just absolutely insane. That being said, you can also use it like on a Spirit Bloom if you're needing a burst healing. I would generally say Fire Breath is using the opener, and then sometimes, more often I'll use my second Tip the Scales on Spirit Bloom. But you want to keep this ability kind of on cooldown, because if you're not benefiting from that effect right there, which is kind of huge. It can be tempting to want to save it for like purging, something that is going to be using the opener, say Power Infusion or Alter Time or something like that. But I would say it's not usually worth holding it for that moment, because if you're not benefiting from the Temporal Burst talent, then I would say you're getting less value than the value you would get from purging one of those abilities. You can Tip the Scales Dream Breath, but I would say this is the absolute worst case scenario, because Dream Breath is really only worth it if you have all the targets echoed, and then also your 2 other abilities just do so much more when they're max level charged. Dream Breath does very little front healing if you max charge it, and then your hot is even worse. A Sleepwalk is our casted CC. It's going to disorient the target and make them move towards you for 6 seconds. It can break on damage, and it shares a DR with other disorients, which are like Fears, Blinds, Mind Controls, stuff like Dragon Breath, Cyclones, and there's a couple other effects that do it as well. Your usage kind of depends on how your comp is running, but I would say a good rule of thumb is to kind of keep it on cooldown as long as the enemy is not DR'd on the effect. So like a lot of times you'll have people hiding behind a pillar, maybe a healer. It's really good to like hover in, sleepwalk them, and then kind of get out. That's a lot of times how you'll see me use it if you watch my gameplay. But again, it depends entirely on team comps, what you're facing, that kind of stuff. A Pressing Roar is a huge utility cooldown for evokers. This is going to cause your next, it's going to like put out a cone in front of you. I'm going to use it here in a second so you can see like how big the cone is, but it basically makes anyone hit by the breath take a the next CC that is cast on them is going to last 50% longer. So like if I pressing roar this training dummy and then I hit sleepwalk, it would normally be 6 seconds, but then it's going to be, I think, like 8 seconds, 8.5, something like that. It's huge. I will say, like, as a noob Preservation Evoker, it seems very obvious that you would want to line up a pressing roar with your deep breath stun, but as you kind of get a little bit better at the spec, you realize it's much better to use a pressing roar on something that is already CC'd to ensure that the next CC lasts longer. So like, let's say one of your teammates has stunned a target, then you use a pressing roar and then you dream breath it and you get that longer CC, and then maybe there's another CC out of that you get to make it last even longer. So just for an example, like maybe I deep breath this target, it's in a 3-second CC, and so then I pressing roar it and then I sleepwalk it, and that sleepwalk is going to be, you know, it was 20 seconds, now it's 30 seconds. In arenas it would be 6 seconds up to 8 seconds, but it's much better to use it on something that's already CC'd to ensure the next CC. Quell is our ranged kick. It can be used while you're silenced. It can be used while you're in Emerald Communion. It can be used in stuff like Root Beam. So it's very important to realize you can still use it in a lot of situations that other ranged kicks could not be used. I would say often as an evoker, you're going to be getting CC'd out of an instant cast CC. So it can kind of be a trap to want to save Quell for, you know, casted CC on yourself. A lot of times it's much better used on important damaging abilities, where maybe because that's more often going to be what you can interrupt, whereas casted CC, a lot of times you won't even have the ability to use it when you need to. I want to bring up Emerald Communion one more time. You can use it while you're in Emerald Communion, and a lot of times like priests will try to mind control you, or Druids will try to cyclone you, or priests will try to mind control you, and you can use Quell while communing to stop those, which are like some of the biggest shutdowns to the cooldown. So it's good to keep that in mind. Naturalize is our dispel. It removes all harmful magical and poison effects. I mean, this is the same for every healer. You just want to be making sure you're dispelling important things on your teammates as quickly as possible. Poisons too. I don't really ever pay attention to poisons. I can't think of a poison in the game that's like ultra important to get off. I'm sure someone down in the comments might let you know. I don't know. Cauterizing Flame is kind of like a buffed naturalize. It removes bleeds, poisons, cure curses and diseases. There's several bleeds in the game that are very important to get off. I'm thinking like Thunderous Roar from Warriors, Rogue's Deathmark, Feral Frenzy from Feral Druids, and there's like several curses from Warlocks, Havoc from Warlocks, which I think like casts, you know, if they have Havoc on one target and they cast a Chaos Bolt on the other target, it's going to hit both targets. So getting Havoc off really soon or really early is really important. They have curses that like slow casting speed and movement speed. You can get those off your teammates. Don't sleep on using Cauterizing Flame. It's something I kind of neglected for a while when I first started playing, but it also heals the target for every negative effect that it cleanses. So it's also a really good heal as well. Tail Swipe and Wing Buffet are two of our racials. Tail Swipe is going to knock an enemy up into the air. It is good to be used as like another interrupt, or also to like kind of, it's like a mini CC. I mean, if you've been knocked up into the air by a monk, you realize how annoying it is to be knocked up in the air for, you know, just a second or two. They can do massive damage, or they can potentially get away when used that way. So I'll just let you see how it works on this squirrel really quick. It just knocks them up in the air. It interrupts the cast if you don't have Quell up. I would say that's probably most often how it's used. And then the same thing with Wing Buffet. It is going to be a good to use as like an interrupt, but also to knock enemies, you know, away, whether you're on a Z-axis and you want to knock them down, or I would say the most often the way I use it is a priest domes their entire team, or a DK, uses anti-magic zone on the entire team. I'm going to hover to them. I'm going to knock them out of the dome or the AMZ so that they don't get the benefit from that spell. But again, it can be used as like an interrupt, other things as well. The last thing I want to mention is hover. Hover, it's honestly crazy that we haven't even covered it yet, but hover is going to be our movement speed ability. with the Chrono Warden talent tree, it's going to act more like a blink, but it's also going to give you a movement speed increase and the ability to cast while moving for 10 seconds after you use it. So I use it, I'm going to get a 3-second damage reduction. I'm going to get a movement speed increase that allows me to also cast while moving. Very important to remember that you can cast while moving. It's a good way to get CC on targets. It's a good way to get damage while you're kiting, that kind of thing. With the Obsidian Metal talent, it also makes you, or not, sorry, Obsidian Metal, with the Unburdened Flight, it also makes it to where you are immune to movement speed reductions while you hover. So we'll talk about that a little bit more here in just a minute. All right, so for our PvP talents, our default kit is going to be Nullifying Shroud, Scouring Flame, and Obsidian Metal. I would say as a new Preservation Evoker, if you're just getting into the spec, just run these 3 for a while until you're ready to move on. That being said, I think Preservation is the one spec in the game that matters the most. That the PvP Preservation Evoker is the one spec in the game that the PvP talents matters the most. So I'm going to go over all of them really quick. Nullifying Shroud just puts 3 charges of a Nullifying Shroud on yourself that prevents the next crowd control from landing on you. There are so many ways to remove Nullifying Shrouds. There's purges. People are going to spam cast micro CCs to get it off as quick as possible. It sounds really good. It is really good, but also it can be removed very quickly by good players. You're going to want to protect this with other buffs so that, you know, purges don't just immediately get rid of your Nullifying Shroud. Casting Echo Reversion on yourself is going to put 2 hots up that can be purged instead of your Nullifying Shroud. Having Echo Dream Breath on yourself will also prevent it. Or not prevent it, but kind of protect your Nullifying Shroud. So that's 4 buffs you could add on top of your Nullifying Shroud to kind of protect it from getting purged. The only time I would not use Nullifying Shroud is against mages, because mages can just straight up steal the buff, and usually that's pretty bad because not only are you losing it yourself, but you're giving the enemy a way to avoid CC. That being said, there are certain scenarios where it's like, if the mage is going to sit there and spend 3 globals on stealing my shrouds, I'm okay with it. So there's that aspect to it too. And if you're protecting your Nullifying Shrouds, maybe it takes them more than 3 globals. Obsidian Metal is going to prevent interrupt, silences, and pushback effects when you're casting, when you have your wall up. When you take this PvP talent, you can use this like specifically for that ability. You need to not, I'm not going to say you need to not think about it as a wall, but you use it to get off important casts, like setting up your stasis in the early game, getting CC. You could even use it to get your Nullifying Shrouds up in the middle of the game. It's a very, very strong talent. It's also very good against classes that have blanket silences. So stuff like DKs, rogues, assassinations, like classes that have abilities that just silence you regardless of whether or not you're casting. Very, very effective into so many different classes. Scouring Flame, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but it's going to make your Fire Breath burn away 1 beneficial magical effect for targets per empower level. This, I feel like this is a staple of not just Preservation, but all Evokers, but this is going to be huge against several different classes. Your biggest classes you want to use this against is like other Evokers, Preservation or Devastation, you know, probably even Augmentation. This is a quick way to get rid of their Nullifying Shrouds, and often in the double Preservation matchup, the Evoker who gets the other Nullifying Shrouds off first is going to be super far ahead. Resto Druids, it's really good at removing their hots and buffs. And then you've got Shamans, it can remove their Earth Shield, which increases their healing done by quite a bit, and a lot of their hots as well. So very good on those classes. It's also very good against stuff like mages, getting off their alter time, removing PI once the priests use it. Like I said, you're going to often line it up with Tip the Scales, but you can also use it every 30 seconds just by manually charging it. So even with like a temporal compression, let me get a temporal compression up. It's going to be a pretty fast cast, you know, to remove 4 buffs on your main target and every other target that it hits. I keep saying 4 because if you run Font of Magic, it'll have 4. Fire Breath will have 4 charges instead of 3, but we'll get back to that later. Dream Projection is a pretty good... Well, I'm not going to say pretty good. It's a very situational talent. Dream Projection is mostly used for the dispel aspect of it, in my opinion. Dream Projection is going to fly out a little projection that you can release, and anyone that you hit with the Dream Projection on the release is going to dispel all their debuffs, and then it's also going to give them a massive hot. Like, this hot is bigger than your Dream Breath, so it is good for the hot as well, but it's mostly going to be used for the dispel. I would say against like elemental shamans, maybe affliction locks, it can be pretty good, but you also need to keep in mind that you're going to be taking any of the like knockback effects, like affliction locks. You're going to get silenced and take a buttload of damage. Priests, if you dispel, I don't know what ability it is, but it's going to horrify you. Ally shamans, it's going to knock you up into the air and make you take some damage. I will say specifically for affliction locks, that removing their, oh man, I'm blanking on the ability. The one that does a lot of damage and silences you though, it used to be a lot scarier in previous expansions. I don't really know what changed about it, but it's not as bad to dispel anymore. And I will usually try to line up Dream Projection with a Obsidian Scales that I have metal. So it protects me from the damage. I don't get silenced, and I get massive dispels on the whole team. It can be very, very good, but kind of requires a little bit of preparation for it. Time Stop is going to be the highest skill cap ability that you have. This is going to be useful for comps like Jungle or Cupid, these setup comps that have long CC chains. It's going to freeze an ally time stream for 5 seconds. While frozen, they're invulnerable, so you can't take any damage, but you also can't get healed, and none of your buffs or debuffs or anything progresses. So like if you have offensive cooldowns up, you're not going to lose 5 seconds of those cooldowns. You're going to come out of it with your full cooldowns up. Same thing with any dots and stuff like that though too. You're going to come out and keep taking the damage that you were taking beforehand. It's basically only going to be used to prevent CC on yourself. You can use it on teammates, but I've talked to several evokers, and really they say the only thing you're going to use this on is to avoid CC. So like I'm talking about in Jungle or Cupid, if you see a pet walking over to you, you'll try to time stop yourself to avoid the initial stun, which kind of prevents the easy trap out of the stun. That kind of thing is how you will use time stop. I would not recommend playing with this until you get to a level where it's kind of necessary to use it that way to win against those comps, which is kind of where I'm at right now. I've got to get better at it, but it is definitely the most difficult PvP talent to use. Unburdened Flight is going to be the one we talked about earlier. It makes it so that your hover buff makes you immune to movement speed reduction effects. There's certain comps where this is basically required. Anything with a DK, because a DK can chains of ice you and just keep you permanently slowed. Assassination rogues also just AoE slowing the entire team. You can never get away, and they do more damage when you're stacked up. Unburdened Flight is a must-have for those kind of comps. Very good ability, very easy to use as well. Swoop Up, I'm not really going to talk about because I've never used it, but basically it's like a rescue for the enemy team. I can take an enemy and move them to a location on the arena by grabbing them and taking them there. There's probably certain comps where it's good to use, but like I said, Preservation Evokers PvP talents are so powerful that this is just not even on the radar, at least for me. Dreamwalker's Embrace is something that is really good into melee cleaves. Whenever you Verdant Embrace a target, it will increase both you and that target's, it's going to tether you to them and increase your movement speed by 40%. It's also going to have like a little line between you and your target that will damage enemies that come in contact with it and siphon the life from them. So like when you're facing an enemy Ret Warrior, Fistweaver, or whatever, you might want to play this talent because you're going to get a movement speed increase and it's going to do damage when you're cleaving him. The only thing I will say about Dreamwalker's Embrace is it requires you to think about your positioning, even more than you normally would have. Where's something that I can heal? Is there no healing target dummies around here? Am I crazy? Do I need to go back into a follower dungeon really quick? Actually, that's not going to work either because I'm not going to be in PvP. So I should be able to use it on this guy right here though. So if I Verdant Embrace this guy, it's going to leave a tether between us, and anyone that steps in that is going to get damage, and then we're going to siphon their life, and it's also giving me a 40% movement speed increase, which is pretty huge. Chrono Loop is another one that I have never personally used. It can be very powerful. I've seen Devastation Evokers use it to very good effect. It's going to freeze an enemy's timeline, it's not going to freeze an enemy's timeline. It's going to trap the enemy in a time loop, and after 5 seconds it's going to put them at the exact HP that they had when you cast the spell, although it won't return them to less than 20%. So say you get an enemy low, but you know you're not going to be able to get the kill. You chrono loop the target, they get their burst healing, and then after 5 seconds, they get returned to that 20%, and then maybe you get the kill then. I would say, again, that this is just not worth ever taking unless you're just really working a comp that can make really good use of it. Other PvP talents are much better, in my opinion. You can dispel the chrono loop. So if the other healer's smart, I believe they can just remove it. The last one is Dreamcatcher. You're not really going to have to worry about this in the next patch. This is going to be baked into the class, but it basically reduces the cooldown. It makes it so that Sleepwalk no longer has a cooldown, and just it takes longer to cast. I don't ever use this, but I have seen this used even against me to good effect. Like when you want to be able to chain a Sleepwalk someone for 10 seconds, you could pick up that talent and do so. Or you know, if you want to be able to use Sleepwalk on one target and then swap it to another target at the end of theirs, just to keep, you know, one target slept the entire time, it's good for that. But again, these are not really my favorite PvP talents to use. So again, we're going to use Null, Scouring, and Obsidian probably like in 80% of games. And when you're first learning Preservation Evoker, I would probably just stick with these. Next up, I want to talk about the optional talents in the talent trees. So we're going to go over a couple different ones. Instinctive Arcana versus Inherent Resistance are the two I usually move around up here. Instinctive Arcana is going to just increase the magic damage you do by 4%, and then Inherent Resistance is going to reduce your magic damage taken by 8%. I usually move between these two because this is like, you know, I want to do more damage if it's going to be a melee cleave, and then I want to take less magic damage if I'm facing a caster cleave. These are two very easy talents to swap between based on the enemy comp. But, you know, as a beginner Preservation Evoker, you could probably just sit with this and be fine if you want to be more offensive, or with the other one if you want to be defensive, because even with melee cleaves, there's still usually a good amount of magic damage. The next one we're going to talk about is Overall versus Time Spiral. Overall is going to make your Oppressing Roar remove one rage effect, and it's going to reduce its cooldown by 30 seconds. Just in general, I think I use this more for the cooldown reduction, just because it's very useful to get a extra long CC, you know, as often as possible. But the enraged effect can be really good against classes like warriors. I honestly don't even know what all you could remove from. I would assume warriors and hunters, but there's probably several other classes that have something you can remove an enrage from. Time Spiral is going to reset or allow you and your teammates to use their major movement ability once for free in the next 10 seconds. So for Evokers, I believe it is Hover. So it's just going to give you an extra charge of Hover as long as you use it in the next 10 seconds after you cast Time Spiral. But more importantly than that, it activates this Time Convergence ability. Non-defensive abilities with a 45-second or longer cooldown grant 5% intellect for 15 seconds. So this is an ability that triggers that, so you just get more intellect. And then I would say it's definitely used for the effect of Time Spiral, but it's also used specifically because of this hero talent choice. Over here on the specialization tree, the tier we're going to be looking at is kind of this third from the bottom. I don't really actually that's not true. I do mess with the ones up here. Font of Magic versus Flow State. Flow State is just a good passive ability to have 2 points in, but whenever you are going to be scouring targets, especially the 3 classes I mentioned, like Resto Shamans, Preservation Evokers, and Resto Druids, you want to have one in Font of Magic when you're running Scouring Flame, because it gives you that extra empower level on Fire Breath. It's going to do more damage. It's going to dispel more abilities. But whenever you're not worried about dispelling as much, or especially if you're not running Scouring Flame, I would say that Flow State is probably better to run. It's also good to remember that like so many classes have purges now that like you don't always need to be getting the, 4 charges of Fire Breath dispels, because a lot of times you're going to be playing with a class that is also dispelling. And then down here in this bottom tree, I think these 3 are the most beginner friendly talents, but you can definitely move these around. Titan's Gift is basically just going to make your essence abilities do more, or your next essence ability. It's going to cause your echo to like do more healing, or your disintegrate to do more damage occasionally. But if you are running Scouring and you're running Font of Magic, it can be good to play Life Giver's Flame if the enemy team is going to be grouped up, or if you're playing against high pet classes. So we're talking about like Unholy DK, Demo Locks, you know, Hunters. It's going to make it to where your Fire Breath is healing your teammates for quite a bit as well. The one thing I will say is if you are using Life Giver's Flame, you need to be using Fire Breath on cooldown to get the value you need from it, to take it over Titan's Gift. Titan's Gift is a pretty solid choice otherwise. The other ones I'm going to move around is going to be Spark of Insight for Energy Loop. Again, this is going to cause your Disintegrate to do more damage and restore mana. You want to be running this into when you think the game is going to go to dampening. But even I still struggle with using enough Disintegrates to make it worth it. You have to kind of think that Spark of Insight is actually saving you some mana as well, because it's giving you free echoes. So every time you get a Essence Burst from Spark of Insight, you're saving yourself 33,000 mana. Obviously, if you can hard cast, you know, full Disintegrates, and you get, you know, 126,000 mana per that Disintegrate, that's a little bit better mana regen, but this is saving you mana as well. And so that is really all of the optional talents. There are probably other acceptable talents to use in the class trees, but I'm not going to go over them because I don't use any other talents. For trinket usage on an evoker, you have to be really careful with your trinket. I would say there's really 3 ways to use your trinket. The first one is going to be Trinket Rescue. That's probably going to be your most powerful way to use Trinket. I don't know if I can rescue players who aren't on my team, but yeah, it won't let me. But Trinket Rescue is going to allow you to move the target out of line of sight. So like if I'm right here, I would be able to rescue this teammate into this doorway, getting him out of range of, you know, getting him away from any melee that was on him, or getting him out of range of casters and out of line of sight of casters, and give me that critical time I need to heal him back up. So Trinket Rescue is going to probably be more often than not your best option to use with Trinket. The other option is going to be Rewind. If you've taken massive damage and you are able to Trinket, get a Rewind off, heal your entire team to full, that is going to be another really good option. I want you to kind of think of Emerald Communion as an alternative to your Trinket. I think we talked about this a little bit earlier, but in most games, you're going to want to Trinket first because it has a 1.5 minute cooldown. You get that on cooldown, then your next save can be Communion, and then you're going to have your Trinket back up for the, you know, third save that you need in that case. But again, rescue first. The final thing, if you're just in dire straits, you don't have rescue, you don't have a Rewind, the next best option is maybe you have a Life Spark perk up like we have right now. You could Trinket, Verdant Embrace, Chrono Flame, because the Verdant Embrace is going to boost your Chrono Flame by 100%. So it'll do massive damage. And if you have time, you might Verdant Embrace Echo Chrono Flame. That'll get your target, you know, probably half their health bar, if not more, if you have the time. But a lot of times when you're Trinketing, you're needing that instant heal really quickly. Yeah, I think that basically covers how I would use your Trinket as a Preservation Evoker. Next up, I want to go over our best and worst comps. I kind of took the opinions of a couple rank 1 Preservation Evokers and then some of my personal experience. So this list may not sound right to you, or maybe you think some comps are good that I say are bad. I think a lot of it's going to depend on your play style and, you know, just generally the players you play with, because there's some really good comps, but they require your teammates to play at a very skillful level to be really good. So all of that you have to take into consideration. I think Rogue Boomy is kind of considered the best class for Preservation Evokers. I think the Rogue just creates so much lockdown that the Preservation Evoker doesn't have to worry so much about getting CC'd, or you have enough peel from your team to enable you to get out of your CC to heal, and then also it just enables you to be so much more offensive than when you are sitting in CC. Other than that, Rogue Devastation Evoker can be pretty good. Double Dragon comps are actually really good. So when you're playing with a dev as a preservation, they can be really good. And then basically, I mentioned those two first because I think those are really powerful. But then Rogue any class is pretty much always good with preservation. I really like running melee cleaves as preservation evokers. So like Ret Warrior, Turbo, you know, that kind of thing. I think those comps are really good. And then Warrior caster comps. I've been running Warrior Shadow Priest myself, and it seems pretty good. I can't even tell you why it works so well, but basically, I think it just has to do with the war. Like you get to be next to the warrior if you need to, or you can be back behind the caster. I can't even explain why it's good. They just feel good. Some of the worst comps, I think warlocks and mages are the hardest to play with on Preservation Evoker. Warlock's entire defensive toolkit involves them porting back and forth 40 yards. And when you're a short range healer and you're constantly like verdant embracing to be right next to them, and then they port, you know, 40 yards away from you, maybe used your hovers to get to them, that kind of thing. Oh my gosh, especially in solo shuffle, it's so hard to heal warlocks. You could probably find, you know, good warlocks to play with that know how to play around evokers, but I have not had success with it. And then mages are kind of the same thing. They are constantly kiting, and they're also very squishy, and I feel like it's hard to use your short range and kind of positional healing on mages to keep them alive. So I don't like playing with them. But again, that's not to say you shouldn't ever play with these classes. I just think they're a little bit harder to play with on evokers. Lastly, before we get to the TLDR, I want to go over our macros. So let me pull up my macros here. So the first thing I'm going to go over is our cursor macros. I showed this in the instance, and I'm going to link all these macros in the Google Doc. So if you click on that in the description, you'll be able to easily copy paste them. But we've got our rescue macro. That's going to allow me to target my teammate and hit my rescue button, and it's just going to rescue them to my cursor immediately instead of me having to do that extra click. It's going to save you a lot of time. Deep breath, same thing. Instead of having to hit deep breath and then click where I want to go, it's just going to cast it. So it's going to cast it at my cursor. I will say it takes a little bit of time to get used to the pathing of deep breath, and sometimes it can be frustrating because you'll be hitting deep breath, but it just like won't be casting because of a minor line of sight issue that it's having or something like that. But once you get used to it, it's super easy to use that way. Same thing with landslide. I didn't even talk about this in our utility, but landslide roots enemies. It's kind of the same thing as deep breath. You can use it in a line. You do want to use this to root, you know, melees. You want to root hunter pets, that kind of stuff as often as possible. It can be basically a great defensive. Same thing at cursor macro. Anything in that line is going to get rooted. Definitely don't forget to use that. Then I have target macros. So what these allow me to do is cast abilities on my target's target without having to target enemies. So I specifically use these on Disintegrate. So it's going to cast Disintegrate on my target's target, and then if I'm targeting an enemy, this is going to cast Disintegrate on my current target. So like if I'm not targeting an ally and I'm just targeting an enemy, I can use Disintegrate on here. I will say there's a little drawback to this macro, because if I'm targeting, say, like a healer and they're targeting their ally, it's actually going to hit the ally instead. But I don't really have too many issues using it this way, because usually I'm targeting my teammate and trying to hit what they're hitting with Disintegrate. That's more often how I use it than not. And then I have that same macro for Living Flame, which is Chrono Flame. Basically, I have a Living Flame macro that just casts a Chrono Flame on my ally's target. If you look at my bars, you can see here that I have it in two places. That's because you want to use Chrono Flame sometimes as a heal and sometimes as damage. So basically, if I'm targeting an ally, I can cast Living Flame on their target for damage, or I can cast Chrono Flame on my ally for healing. And then if I am hard targeting an enemy, I will just use the same one that I use for healing to target the enemy. It sounds kind of confusing, but I swear once you play the class, it just gets ingrained in your mind. I talked about stasis a little bit earlier. There's a way to release stasis. So if you cast stasis, charge it up, and then hit the stasis button again, it will release the spells. But if you are in CC, that won't work because it counts as like an ability press. The way to release stasis when you are in CC is to actually have a cancel or a stasis macro. And that will allow you to cast it while in CC or like when you're in the middle of a deep breath. I would just get used to using this macro to release your stasis as opposed to using the ability, because it works 100% of the time where the other one won't work maybe half the time. Arena 1, 2, 3 macros. These are pretty common. I've got Arena 1, 2, 3 macros for Dream Walk or Sleepwalk and Quell for interrupts. And then I also have a focus macro for Quell. I will say that I have always tried to use Arena 1, 2, 3 macros for both interrupts and then CC. CC makes sense, but Quell, my interrupt, I will say that once you start using focus targets, you're just going to be more accurate and more consistent with your interrupts than using Arena 1, 2, 3. At least in my experience, I get way more interrupts when I am using a focus target than before when I wasn't using them. And the last one I would say is the time stop macro. Time stop can be used on any teammate, but like I said, you're really only going to ever be using it on yourself to avoid taking a CC chain. So for time stop specifically, I just have a macro that casts it on my name. You would just replace my name with your name in this macro. I think you could probably put player in there. I don't know if that's 100% accurate though, so you may mess around with it a little bit and make sure that it's working correctly. I would say for safety's reasons though, I would just put your character's name in the macro and call it good. That way you can be targeting allies and use it on yourself without having to change your target to yourself. If you want to be really sweaty with it, you could have a separate, just regular time stop macro if you do find yourself wanting to use it on your ally at some point. But yeah, 99% of the time you're going to be using it on yourself. And so that really concludes the guide. If you've made it all the way here, then you don't really need this next section. Make sure you like the video and subscribe to the channel if you found this useful. Let me know any questions you have down in the comments. And if you think I got something wrong, feel free to leave a criticism in the comments as well. I do always appreciate constructive criticism. I'm not the absolute best Preservation Evoker, but I do feel like I have a pretty good grasp on the class. But now we're going to go over like a TLDR version of the healing and damage for people who didn't want to sit through that long of a video. So to start off for our core healing rotation, we are going to try to maintain Echo on our main healing target. We also want to kind of try to keep up double Echo reversion on a second target as well. It's going to give 2 targets hots. It's also going to have a chance to trigger life sparks, which will give you instant cast chrono flames, which you can use for healing or damage. You want to, as often as possible, echo one teammate, Verdant Embrace a second teammate to get life bind up on all 3 of you before casting additional healing. On cooldown, you want to be using Verdant Embrace, but you also want to be using Spirit Bloom. You want to echo your main healing target and try to, as often as possible, get a 3-charge Spirit Bloom. That is because a 3-charge Spirit Bloom is going to send out 3 additional Chrono Flames to heal. It's going to give them each a hot, all of your teammates a hot, and it's also going to give you 9% haste. So very huge. I didn't mention this on the Verdant Embrace, but Verdant Embrace will also increase the healing of your next Chrono Flame or Dream Breath by percentage. And that brings us to Dream Breath. I wouldn't say this is as necessary on cooldown, but pretty often you want to be keeping Dream Breath up on your targets for the maintenance hots. As often as possible, you want to try to echo 2 targets before you Dream Breath to get the double hots up. And again, if you use Verdant Embrace before setting this off and you don't cast a Chrono Flame between using Verdant Embrace and Dream Breath, it's going to do 40% more healing. Our cooldowns, our big one's going to be Stasis. We're going to want to use this as soon as possible once the game starts to charge it up, and then we're going to want to use it on cooldown. The best Stasis combo is going to be to Stasis, cast Verdant Embrace. Someone cast Echo on your main healing target and then do a 3-stack Spirit Bloom. When you release stasis, it's going to cast all 3 of those spells in quick succession to do massive AoE healing. You can release stasis while you're in CC if you have the macro, and that combo specifically is not going to require line of sight, and I don't think it matters as far as range either. Emerald Communion is going to be our next big healing cooldown. It's going to heal you to max and then do massive AoE healing to your teammates. You want to, as often as possible, try to echo one of your teammates and then Verdant Embrace your other teammate before using it, because then it's going to do massive healing. Otherwise, it's kind of a mid healing cooldown. Sometimes you have to use it that way. So just, yeah, as often as possible, you want to get life bind up on your teammates before using it. It can be stopped by cyclones, diamond eyes traps, demon hunter banish, and then sometimes Priest will try to mind control you because it will heal their team. You can use Quell while you are in the middle of a communion to stop casts without stopping the Emerald Communion, so it's good to keep that in mind. Rewind is going to be our final healing cooldown. We're going to want to use that after massive AoE damage. It's not going to be good if your entire team is low, but they've kind of just been sitting low for a while and not taking burst damage. This is only good on burst damage. It doesn't calculate correctly when you are sitting in a cyclone, so don't use this out of a, directly after sitting a 6-second cyclone, because it's not going to do any healing. And then rescue is probably the best healing cooldown because you can bring your teammate out of line of sight and it's going to give them a 30% shield. So we use it, we bring them over here, we have a few seconds to heal them up before the melee reconnect or the casters get in line of sight. You can use Chrono Flames as spot healing. This is your casted heal. You don't really want to hard cast it though. You want to be using the instant cast Chrono Flames that you get from Life Spark to keep your teammates up. And just a general rule of thumb, you always want to be echoing before each heal. I don't know if I mentioned this, but you don't want to split your echo reversions. So I don't want to echo one target and reversion another, because that you just get one stack of reversion on each target. You always want to echo and reversion the same target so that you can get the double buff, because it also provides 10% more healing to that target. As a Preservation Evoker, you also need to be very offensive while you're healing. So the core damage rotation is to use Fire Breath on cooldown, trying to max charge it as often as possible, because you're going to get these additional Chrono Flames that get cast out. And then it's also going to cause your next Living Flame to strike additional targets per empower level. So as often as possible, you want to be Fire Breathing on cooldown. Tip the Scales is going to give you massive haste, cooldown reduction, and movement speed, and cause your next Fire Breath or Spirit Bloom to be instant cast. This is massive damage, also massive healing, and gives you huge bonus effects. So you want to be using Tip the Scales very quickly. After our Fire Breath is being used on cooldown, we want to be using instant cast Living Flames or Chrono Flames from the Life Spark talent to do damage. And then we have Disintegrate that we can also use for damage. This is a channeled ability. You got to remember that you can use it while moving if you have hover up, but you only want to be using Disintegrate during Essence Burst procs. It is too expensive to use actual Essence on unless you know for a fact you're going to get a kill. You only want to be using it when you get an Essence Burst from, your reversions or Living Flames. And then lastly, you can hard cast Chrono Flames if none of the other abilities are up, and your team is healthy and you're not worried about getting interrupted. You can hard cast Chrono Flames on enemies. Deep Breath is also a good amount of damage and will stun enemies, but I wouldn't really think about it as damage as much as I would think about it of the utility of not being able to get CC'd while you're mid Deep Breath, and the fact that it stuns your enemies is pretty good too. Just general tips as far as playing Preservation Evoker in arenas. You want to echo before every heal. You want to track your essence bursts and use them, and use temporal compressions. Every time you cast an bronze spell, it's going to give you 1 stack of temporal compression. When you get to 4 stacks and you cast your next essence or your next empower ability, it's going to give you a free essence burst. So if you're ever essence starved, just remember that you could probably just cast an empowered ability and get a free essence. And then utilize Sleepwalk kind of on cooldown as long as it's not DR'd, whether it be an off target or the healer, just to help your team set up CC. A Pressing Roar is huge in you want to use it on an already CC target to increase the duration of the next CC, as opposed to just kind of sending it willy-nilly. Other than that, I think that is the end of the Preservation Evoker guide. Again, if you like the video, make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, come check me out on Twitch where I stream at least 4 nights a week, and I will see you guys in the arenas.